Just a minute. And good evening, and welcome to WorldOregon's webinar with our guest speaker, Cass Sunstein, speaking on his book, Liars, Falsehoods, and Free Speech in an Age of Deception. We're thrilled to have him joining us here tonight, and I'll give him a proper introduction in just a minute. Just a few opening words. First of all, a huge thanks to MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust for making tonight's program possible, and a special welcome to the guests of the Trust who are joining us along with many WorldOregon members for tonight's discussion. Secondly, if you haven't had a chance, we encourage you to join our partner Broadway Books, who has this book on sale. There's a link on our webpage where you registered for this event to purchase it from your local bookstore, Broadway Books. A reminder that WorldOregon webinars are for the benefit of WorldOregon members and partners. It will be recorded and probably later posted. So we ask you to mind your P's and Q's for good civil graces. You can post your questions in the Q&A function of Zoom. We will post in chat some links to different things, including his book and other relevant items. Including, I want to mention two big events we have coming up for WorldOregon. Tomorrow we have a program on the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion with Peter Kornbluh, a Cuba expert. Should be a fascinating lunchtime program. And at the end of the month, April 29th, we have our big annual fundraiser held virtually, WorldQuest. We would love for you to join us for that. You can RSVP online. It's a free event with a fundraiser to help support us. And without further ado, I would dive in now to introduce our speaker tonight. Cass Sunstein is a well-known Harvard Law professor. He is a chair of a technical advisory committee for the World Health Organization, and recently has become a senior counselor for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's previously worked in the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in a previous administration. He is speaking tonight in his personal capacity about his book. And so I encourage the questions to be mostly focused around his book and this fascinating subject that we'll be discussing. A couple other highlights of him: he has received the Holberg Prize from the Government of Norway, which is often described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Law and Humanities. He has written many articles, and some of you may have his previous books, including Nudge, How Change Happens, and Too Much Information. And last, to share, Cass was just sharing with us the good news that his wife, Samantha Power, who many of you will remember was really a fantastic international speaker series lead off in 2020, was just received unanimous committee approval for her nomination to be the administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Bipartisan support in this day and age is quite something rare. She will still be going up, of course, for the full Senate confirmation, but that is remarkable. Many of you will remember that we had a previous USAID official from the last administration discussing it, and hopefully maybe once again in the future we can have her on and talk about her new role there. So it's quite an impressive speaker, quite a family. We are very honored to have him joining tonight, and I'm passing the mic to him for his talk on his book about liars, falsehoods, and free speech in an age of deception. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and I feel especially pleased and honored to be following my wife, who is famously a spectacular speaker, and both of us are kind of competitive athletes, and I feel the juices going. I don't know if I can live up to the standard she set, but I feel I'm going to try to get kind of close. That'll be hard, but I'm going to do my best. I have three epigraphs with which to begin about the subject of lying and truth-telling. The first is this: some lies are selfish. Some inflate or conflate or mitigate or simply omit. Some lies are told for good reason. People lie because they think it doesn't matter. They lie because telling the truth would mean giving up control, or because the truth is inconvenient, or because they don't want to disappoint, or because they desperately want it to be true. I've heard them all. I've told them all. That's from the mystery writer Michael Rowbottom, a book called Good Girl, Bad Girl. The second epigraph is from Hannah Arendt a number of years ago, who wrote very crisply, "Seen from the viewpoint of politics, truth has a despotic character. It is therefore hated by tyrants who rightly fear the competition of a coercive force they cannot monopolize, and it enjoys a rather precarious status in the eyes of all governments." The third is from Shakespeare, and I hope you're going to notice the multiple puns in this somewhat off-color meditation on romance and love and truth and lying. "When my love swears that she is made of truth," Shakespeare writes, "I do believe her, though I know she lies, that she might think me some untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtleties, thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although she knows my days are past the best, simply I credit her false-speaking tongue. On both sides thus is simple truth suppressed. But wherefore says she not she is unjust," meaning unfaithful, "and wherefore say not that I am old," and she is lying and saying she thinks him young. "Oh, love's best habit is in seeming trust, and age in love loves not to have years told. Therefore," and here are the best puns, "I lie with her and she with me, and in our faults by lies we flattered be." That's complicated. It's about romance. Now let's turn to our country. In a famous judicial opinion from a long time ago, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., a great fan of freedom, wrote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." Right now, and these are my words, a lot of people, including some public officials, have been falsely crying fire in a crowded theater, and they have caused panics, including on that awful day, January 6th of this year. In some cases, lies lead to illnesses and deaths. That's happening. In other cases, lies cut at the heart of democratic self-government. Some lies are coming from foreign governments. Some are very homegrown. They come from elected officials and from politicians or those who support them. Despite these kind of hair on fire points, my first goal here, which was not my goal when I started to write this book, it emerged against my will. My first goal is to deepen the foundations of what many people now consider to be a jarring idea. Let's put this in bold letters. In general, falsehoods ought not to be censored or regulated, even if they are lies. Free societies protect them. Public officials should not be allowed to act as the truth police. And I've noted, I did not expect this to be the first goal of the book, the protection of lies. It snuck up on me. A key reason for that conclusion is we just can't trust officials to separate truth from falsehood. Their own judgments are unreliable and their own biases get in the way. If officials are licensed to punish falsehoods and even lies, they will end up punishing dissent. The greatest opinion in the history of the Supreme Court, in my opinion, was written not by Oliver Wendell Holmes, by Robert Jackson, who wrote in the greatest lines in that greatest of opinions, the following: Those who begin coercive elimination of dissent soon find themselves exterminating dissenters. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. Those words were written in the midst of the Nazi threat. Let's repeat them now, where there are tyrants in our midst, by which I mean planet, not Oregon or Washington. I mean our planet. Compulsory unification of opinion achieves only the unanimity of the graveyard. The best response to falsehoods, including lies, is usually not to punish or censor them, but to correct them. Punishment or censorship can operate like oxygen. These are old ideas, but in some ways they're now on the defensive. We need to understand them better and appreciate them more. We need to do that above all to protect against government overreach, but also to allow freedom to flourish in magazines, online, and newspapers, and also on the beleaguered social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So the first goal is to deepen the foundations of an old idea, which is that the best remedy for falsehoods and lies is more speech, not the threat of jail. But my second goal, and this was my original purpose in the book, it's still there, but as the second goal, is to qualify these conclusions and to take some of them back. The great poet William Blake wrote marginalia, that is notes in the margin of his text of lectures by Sir Joshua Reynolds, a great artist whom Blake grapples with intellectually. Reynolds was a great fan of generalization and said that's what art is about, generalization. And Blake, with exasperation, wrote in the margin, to generalize is to be an idiot. To particularize is the alone distinction of true merit. And Blake added with a kind of mischief and I think cry of his heart, I thank God I am not like Reynolds. Aiming not to be like Reynolds, that is a fan of generalization, I'm going to contend that government should have the power to regulate certain lies and falsehoods. The basic principle, which I'll attempt to concretize, is false statements are not constitutionally protected if the government can show that they threaten to cause serious harm that cannot be avoided through a more speech protective route. That's a mouthful. False statements are not constitutionally protected if the government can show that they threaten to cause serious harm that cannot be avoided through a more speech protective route. For fans of freedom out there, and I am one, this effort to take back my broad endorsement of freedom might be alarming. I want to soften the alarm by suggesting perjury is not protected by freedom of speech. It threatens to cause serious harm that you can't avoid through a more speech protective route. If I tell you drink this diet soda and your hair will grow back, I would that it were true. That's fraud. It's not protected by the First Amendment. If I go to the police and say that my neighbor is right there, my neighbor. If I say my neighbor is selling cocaine and also engaging in an assortment of fraudulent acts, and that's a lie by me, that's a crime. I've done something against the law. And that crime is not protected by the First Amendment. That is to say, certain lies already are regulable, and I've given a little bit of a framework to try to explain why. These are narrow exceptions, but they're really important. To protect the democratic process, I suggest government should be able to regulate certain kinds of lies and falsehoods, certainly if they are defamatory, and we'll get there. It should also be able to regulate doctored videos like deep fakes, which can portray any of us as doing anything at all. This is a technology that could portray you or me endorsing and actually practicing terrorism, endorsing and practicing something horrible that involves criminal activities, that is, under certain assumptions, actually a form of defamation. And the basic claim is the coming threat of deep fakes, a threat to democratic processes and individual reputation, is not one that government should be powerless to counteract. I'm also going to suggest that private institutions, including newspapers, online magazines, and social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, have a fair bit of room to slow or stop the spread of lies and falsehoods, and that they should be doing more than they're doing now. Okay, we need a framework that's a little more disciplined than the mouthful I gave. And I'm going to make another confession about the genesis of this book. In the first stages, I went to a commercial press and said, let's do a book that's in the nature of a manifesto about lies and how damaging they are, how we need to do something about them. And the commercial press said, that's an exciting book. We want to publish that book. As I kept thinking about it, as I told you, the simplicity of the manifesto started to trouble me, and I started getting nervous about the truth police. So I said to the commercial press, it's actually maybe not so much a manifesto. It's got a first goal, freedom, 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 and a second goal, qualification, qualification, qualification. At that point, the commercial press got a little less excited about the book. They still wanted to publish it, but they thought, this is kind of a book that has two faces. It doesn't have a simple tale. And I talked to an academic press, Oxford University Press, which published the book, and they said, the book you are describing, that's a terrific book for us. And that meant the book you are hearing has the two faces, and I've just described each. That's the first confession. The second confession is in the final draft of the book, I had the conclusion you heard, which is about protecting most falsehoods, except if they are threatened to create serious harm that can't be prevented through other routes. And a friend of mine said, I like this book a whole lot, but you need more than that sentence. You need a framework. You need a real framework, not a sentence. And you're about to hear the framework, which is my favorite chapter of the book, and it was a really late edition. Here's the framework. There are a ton of falsehoods out there, and they're different from one another. A cry of fire might be a lie designed to cause a stampede by an evildoer. Or it might be an innocent mistake coming from someone who saw smoke from an audience member and thought it was a fire. A seller of a car might lie about the vehicle's gas mileage. That's different from a cry of fire in a crowded theater. On a date, a guy might lie about his achievements. He might say he was a varsity athlete when he kind of wasn't. Someone might perjure himself, saying he wasn't at the scene of the accident. Someone might make an innocent error, mistakenly identifying someone as the perpetrator of a crime, but it was an innocent mistake. To approach these diverse kinds of falsehoods, we need, I'm suggesting, bear with me now, to identify 4 different issues and to keep them separate. So we're going to have 4 issues, and I'm going to suggest that if we have the 4 issues in mind, we can come up with a framework that'll help us think about falsehoods without saying, yay, free speech, or boo, liars. The first question, number 1, is the state of mind of the speaker. In saying something that's false, people might be lying. They might be saying, my neighbor has cocaine, when the person completely knows there's no cocaine there. Or people might be saying that, random example, a presidential nominee, who's my wife, did something which they full well she didn't. That's a lie. At the opposite extreme is a reasonable but mistaken statement. You might say, for example, that I think my neighbor was involved in a crime and I had some evidence for that, but it was untrue. Those are the poles. In the middle, you could see someone who makes a statement that isn't quite a lie, but is kind of reckless. You might imagine a journalist who says something about a politician or about a public figure. Taylor Swift, say, whom I greatly admire. They might say something about Taylor Swift or about a politician that they really ought to have known is false, but they didn't know it was false. They didn't check their sources. Reckless. Or it might not be as bad as reckless. It might be just negligent. They didn't show due care. They weren't, kind of wildly out of touch with integrity, but they didn't do what they should have done. Okay, now we have four points on the continuum: lying, recklessness, negligence, and reasonable errors. It really matters in which category you fall. Liars shouldn't receive the same kind of protection as innocent, mistaken people. Someone might say, I think climate change isn't a problem. In my view, most scientists would agree, that is a mistake, but it could be a completely innocent mistake. The second question, and now we're 25% of the way done with the framework, is the magnitude of the harm. How much damage is caused by the falsehood? We can say, just for simplicity, that there are four kinds: catastrophic harm, serious harm, moderate harm, and basically nothing. If someone is doing something that threatens catastrophic harm by stating a lie that's threatening to cause, let's say, significant loss of life, that's very different from someone saying something like, actually, President Kennedy was vice president, not President Kennedy. That's false. It doesn't seem to be harmful at all. It's either non-existent or minor. And you could imagine a case where the harm is real, but it's moderate. It's not catastrophic. In deciding whether harm should be regulated, it really matters which of the four it is: catastrophic, serious, moderate, minor to non-existent. Now we're halfway done with the framework. The third question is, how likely is the harm? You could have harm that's certain, with 100% likelihood it's going to happen. If someone falsely cries fire in a crowded theater, there's no doubt something bad's going to happen. It could be it's probable, it's not certain. It could be it's unlikely, but there's a significant chance it's going to happen, like 30%, 40%, 25%, or it could be highly improbable. A falsehood that threatens to create certain harm, as when a seller lies about a product saying it's going to cause medical health benefits that are not going to happen, and that with certainty will lead people to buy the product, and that's harmful, is very different from a case in which the harm is really improbable, as when someone says something like, dropped objects don't fall. That's a falsehood, but the harm induced by it is trivial because no one is going to believe it. And if they believe it, they're going to learn in a hurry that they ought not to believe it. The fourth and final question involves the timing of harm. There's a continuum. It could be imminent. It's going to happen now. It could be soon, meaning it's going to happen tomorrow. It could be that it's reasonably soon, meaning within a month, within 2 months, or it could be distant future. A libel saying, for example, that you committed a serious crime can easily be seen to create imminent harm. A claim by one teenager to another that smoking cigarettes is actually good for you can plausibly be seen, this isn't obvious, but can plausibly seen to create long-term harm. Okay, now you have the framework. State of mind of the speaker, the magnitude of the harm, the likelihood of the harm, and the timing of the harm. And I've given 4 points on a continuum for each of them. These can be mixed and matched in numerous ways, 256 to be precise. We could create a matrix with that number of boxes and try to give an indication of how to resolve the free speech issue on the basis of which of the 256 boxes is involved. As an act of mercy, let's really not do that. Let's allow this to suffice. That just intuition suggests that if we have a lie, meaning the person knows it's false, the harm is catastrophic, it's certain to happen, and it's imminent, then regulate. That's not hard. That's easy. If we have a case where the state of mind is innocent mistake, the magnitude of the harm is minor, the likelihood that that harm will occur is small, and when that harm occurs, if it occurs, it's going to occur in the distant future, forget about it. Don't regulate it. And now we know also when cases would be hard. If we have a case in which the speaker is reckless rather than a liar, in which the harm is serious rather than catastrophic, in which the likelihood of the harm is 30%, 40%, not highly improbable, and in which it's going to happen reasonably soon, not immediately, not the distant future, then reasonable people can argue about how to handle that case. So what I'm suggesting is that the little framework, the late addition to this book, helps at least the author concretize the general proposition that falsehoods and even lies are protected unless they threaten to cause serious harm that can't be prevented through speech protective routes. And this framework basically helps explain how to handle easy cases and why they're easy, and how to deal with hard, easy cases for regulation as well as against regulation, and how to see why the hard cases are hard and maybe can orient judgments about how to handle them. Okay, I want to suggest at this point that some of the most exciting free speech developments in the last 3 years have involved a broadening of the tools that both private and public institutions can bring to bear on what I hope is clear for all of us is a fundamental problem for health and safety and democracy, which is the persistence and power of lies and falsehoods. Before I get to that, I want to just give you a little data about how the human mind works. And if you remember anything from these remarks, I hope it's what I'm about to say. I don't know if you all heard this, but Tiger Woods announced his permanent retirement from golf. Did you all hear this news today? Okay, what I just said was false. That's not true. He has not announced his retirement from golf. I chose as an example of the psychological phenomena I'm about to describe what I hope is a benign illustration of the phenomenon. So if the psychological work holds in the context of right now, many of you, and I apologize for this, are going to remember weeks later, months later, possibly years later, that Tiger Woods retired in 2021 after his accident. Even though I told you immediately after I told you the falsehood that it was a falsehood. The phenomenon is called truth bias. And what it means is that the human mind codes statements as credible, even if in real time, the human mind is told, don't believe that. Truth bias is a fiendish and alarming phenomenon. It has evolutionary roots, potentially, where if a neighbor tells you there's a tiger next door, run. You don't bother to pause and think, maybe there's not a tiger next door, you run. But if truth bias is present, it means that the human mind will tend, against its will even, to believe things that are false in some part of the mind, even if on reflection you think it's not so. So if someone says something about a politician, maybe about their emails, maybe about their corruption, even if you think that that is a lie, some part of your mind will code what you heard as true. That's very disturbing. It suggests that exposures to falsehoods are not adequately corrected by truth, which is why my second goal, which is to qualify my general pro-freedom stand, the qualifications have sound empirical roots in how the human mind works. If you are told by a friend or a politician or an enemy or a neighbor something, and the person says right after, that's false, you in some part of your head are going to reflect a belief in it, even a long time after. Okay, that's the empirical alarming finding. The also alarming finding is falsehoods appear to travel better and faster than truth. Maybe because they're more gripping, maybe because they're more jarring, maybe because they attach themselves to the amygdala, which is a part of the human mind that if it is activated, a lot of attention is paid. And that's combination of truth bias and the comparatively greater power of falsehood than truth can be damaging for democratic processes. Okay, here's the good news. If falsehoods threaten to create harm, governments can impose a jail sentence, impose a criminal fine, impose a civil fine, authorize private citizens to bring damage actions in court, maybe could require someone to provide a disclaimer or a disclosure, might require labels and warnings, might come up with a corrective strategy of its own, maybe by telling the truth and making it readily available. The basic point is the number of tools that the government has is large. It's not just censor or not. Private institutions have an assortment of tools also. And the development of more tools is the exciting one of the last years. Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter can take things down. They can require disclosure. False before you see something, rather than false after you say something. Or a falsehood is there and the social media platform provides context. That might not be maximally effective, but it is more freedom friendly than taking the material down. Social media platforms can use their architecture in creative ways, maybe by downgrading falsehoods so that fewer people see them, or maybe by educating users so that it's really easy to find out what's true. There are novel possibilities here. Some platforms are adopting very creative ways of combating falsehoods and lies by taking the worst ones down, by taking less bad ones into a kind of architecture of non-distribution so that they're not down, but then not a lot of people are going to see them. Perhaps by, for ones that aren't quite as bad as those, having a big false before you see them. Perhaps for others that aren't as bad as those, saying if you want to see the fuller story, see this. And perhaps for those that aren't as bad as those, just having a lot of truthful information, maybe in an easily accessible place on the platform. The basic idea here is that if you have a framework like my 4-part framework, you can bring it in contact with the repertoire of tools and use the most aggressive ones for the things that are worse along the 4 dimensions, and use the softest ones for those that are not so bad along the relevant dimensions. Okay, I'm going to have some concluding remarks here and kind of go up 10,000 feet from where we've descended to the on the ground. Okay, there are time-honored arguments for protecting freedom of speech. The government's own judgments about what is true and what is false might not be trustworthy. And I'm saying for freedom of speech, even with respect to falsehoods and lies. Regulation of falsehoods might and probably will chill truthful statements. If you tell journalists that if you say something false, you'll be punished, they might just shut up. Apart from that, we can learn from false statements. Our engagement with falsity about, say, COVID or climate change can deepen our understanding. It's also really important for all of us to know what our fellow citizens think, even if what they think is untrue. So to allow falsehoods is to allow a certain kind of truth to spread, which is about the distribution of opinions in society. Banning false statements can make them alluring and powerful. A counter speech, even if it's not more effective than prohibition, recall truth bias, can be better in the sense that it reduces the power and allure, the magnetism of the lie. That's the basic pitch for freedom with respect to falsehoods. The second goal is specified in the statement that these statements don't support the broad conclusion that a system of free expression must always give strong protection to lies and falsehoods. Some lies are prohibited by long-standing law. Consider fraud, false commercial advertising, lying to the FBI, and perjury. Some of them involve new problems, doctored videos and deep fakes. The growing toolbox of governments is a happy note here. Because so much speech occurs online, governments can consider creative tools for reducing the spread of damaging falsehoods, such as labels, warnings, disclosures, and uses of architectures. These points, I'm hopeful, offer a fresh perspective on problems old and new. Private institutions should be acting more aggressively to control defamation and other falsehoods and lies. Facebook should be doing more than it is now doing to prevent the spread of misinformation involving health and safety and distribution of doctored videos and deep fakes. These are really specific conclusions but they bear on some of the largest and most general questions in all of politics and law, maybe more than in a long time today. And indeed, they bear on questions in daily life and in our interactions with one another. Hannah Arendt, a hero of my book, put it this way: what is at stake here is the common and factual reality itself. And this is indeed a political problem of the first order. My proposition is that the inspiring principle of freedom of speech should not be taken to forbid reasonable efforts to protect reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cass. This is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs for WorldOregon. Great perspective. We've got some good questions coming in from folks. I want to start with, you of course quoted one of my favorite poets, William Blake, and I love this notion of being particular over the tyranny of the loosey-goosey general, which made me think of Barnett Newman, the great artist, his notion about deliberating what is immediate and particular, which is to ask, what is the difference between truth and fact? Is one more about being indisputable and one being more acceptable?
Well, I think whether there's a difference between truth or fact depends on how we define them. So in English, it's not reckless to define a fact as something that is true, in which case they are overlapping and almost coextensive concepts. If you say that something evaluative, like it's wrong to discriminate on the basis of race, it's not in ordinary English self-evident that that's a fact, but it's true. So you might say it's a fact that dropped objects fall, and that if you breed a dog and a fish, you're not going to come up with a creature. They can't breed together. Those are facts. But there are other propositions that are true that aren't like testable hypotheses. So the relationship between fact and truth depends on our definition of each. In ordinary language, it's not unnatural to define a fact so that all facts are true, but many true statements are not facts.
Well, so here's a question from one of our audience members. How do we navigate situations where there is disagreement about the truth of a central fact, in the sense that there are, with many contentious political issues, the truth of a statement is very, very deeply colored by the lived experience of the individual?
That's true and kind of concerning. So I'm thinking, of course, about climate change, that I might have lived experience which is compatible with any number of positions on climate change, but I hope that wouldn't color my judgment about climate change. And my lived experience may or may not be compatible with some claims about the risk posed by certain chemicals like silica, but my lived experience wouldn't tell me a whole lot that's authoritative about whether silica causes disease. So I think lived experience, at least for a certain dimension of a certain category of facts, is an imperfect guide. Now, my lived experience does tell me that dropped objects fall, and that Taylor Swift is really great. The first is a fact. The second is evaluative judgment that I believe to be truthful, but isn't a fact in the same sense. I think for purposes of thinking about freedom of speech, it's a little easier, so that if you have contested factual judgments about, take your pick of issues, about whether the world is going to get a certain degree hotter by 2100, or whether particulate matter, which is a very bad air pollutant, causes one level of risk or another level of risk. There are people who have competing views, let them all in, and there are people who have false views, let them in too, I say. That a false view about particulate matter or climate change, we don't want government acting as the truth police, partly because it's unreliable and partly because it's essential to science that people be allowed to make false claims. Galileo is, I think the tale of Galileo is consistent with my enthusiasm for freedom with respect to false scientific claims. Now, if it's a health claim, then we're back to my framework. So if someone says, look, my lived experience is that COVID-19 just isn't dangerous. I've been around for a year and I haven't gotten sick and I haven't worn a mask. I wouldn't want to censor that statement at all. But if it turns into a statement about medical advice, which is, imminently threatening to public health, then there's a discussion to be had, certainly for private institutions. And Facebook, to its credit, has been willing to take steps to prevent statements that create imminent risk of harm in the context of COVID-19.
Well, that points to the thing that Tom Nichols has written so well about, which is the death of expertise. And this notion that, I did my research from a Google search and a YouTube video. I mean, do you see us being able to return science and public policy and I don't know, soft power diplomacy back into a mainstream where it is actually seen as something we could believe in wholesale.
I think the last year has not been a good one for those who are skeptical about expertise, notwithstanding the imperfection and at times uneven path of scientists. So, the experts have designed vaccines, and while there's some dispute out there, the clear evidence is it's good to be vaccinated and it's bad to have COVID-19. So not to have a significant role for experts in the case of medical risks would be, what's the right word? Much worse than reckless. It would be crazy. And so, like as Mark Twain said about his own death, reports of the death of expertise are premature.
Well, it also points to, social media, for all of its good and its bad. Do you see a difference between aggressively regulating the content itself of speech on social media and aggressively regulating the algorithms used to guide the user experience of the platform?
Okay, so we have two separate questions. The first is what social media platforms themselves should do to combat the spread of falsehoods, put government to one side. And not everyone thinks about the following fact, which is that the First Amendment of the Constitution applies to the governments, but doesn't apply to private institutions. So if Facebook wants to restrict speech that the government can't, it's not vulnerable to a constitutional objection. And for Facebook to be thinking creatively about how best to respond to threats to public safety and health, and also threats to democracy that are posed by lies, let's put lies first and then falsehood second, that's a really good thing. So let me give you some examples. If people say on Facebook, the election actually has been changed. It's not on November, whatever, it's on November, it's in December. And that's destructive to voting, and to restrict that is not a bad idea for an institution as influential as Facebook. If someone says, look, in Oregon, the polls are closing at 4 p.m. and they're not opening until 3 p.m., so you only have an hour to vote, that is false and it's destructive to democracy. And my understanding is Facebook wouldn't allow it. If someone says something about cancer or heart disease or COVID-19 or vaccination that creates an imminent risk to public health, Facebook will regulate it. And I think that's a good idea. We have to be very careful about what the category and what the evidence and whether there's sufficient neutrality. All that's fair, but to generalize is to be an idiot, said our friend, our hero, Blake. To particularize is the alone distinction of true merit. And what I'm suggesting is, with respect to falsehoods and lies, we need to particularize. What is it? If someone says on Facebook that, it's just not true that the earth is getting hotter, that's a different question in terms of regulation than someone who says the polls are closing at 3 p.m. That's something where there's a reasonable argument people get to talk that through. The algorithm, Facebook itself deals with new versions of its algorithm. I've occasionally been a consultant to Facebook. I don't have particular visibility into that, but I know Facebook thinks about its algorithm, of course, and what functions it's serving. If the algorithm can be used in a way that promotes or doesn't promote attention to things that have been shown, let's say, by independent fact finders to be false. And Facebook has been interested in notifying people at a minimum that things from independent fact finders that have been shown to be false have been shown by independent fact finders to be false. So there's algorithmic downgrading, let's say, of distribution is one remedy. Another remedy is algorithmic attachment, let's say, of a disclaimer to things that have been shown to be false. For the government to deal with Facebook's algorithms and falsehoods on social media, there's more delicacy there because the First Amendment does apply. But if there's libel on Facebook, libel that is regulable by longstanding law, then that's regulable by longstanding law. So the Supreme Court has, and the court's kind of rethinking this now a bit, it seems, it's given a lot of protection to falsehoods about public figures, but not complete. If you lie about a public figure, you're not protected by the First Amendment. And if you're reckless about it, you're not protected by the First Amendment if it's defamatory. For Facebook to take on board those standards would be completely legitimate. And for Congress to say that Facebook has to is also completely legitimate. The devil is in the details here. But I want to say a favorable point for a Supreme Court justice with whom I often do not find myself in agreement, that is Justice Clarence Thomas. And the favorable point is he's asking us to rethink the very strong protection given to libel is fair. I don't want to say that he's right to say that the longstanding protection should be eliminated. I don't quite agree with that. But to put on the agenda exactly what are we going to do when people destroy other people's reputations? Would it be so awful if what we said was there's a right of retraction? Would it be so awful if we said that the person who hurt someone else's reputation has to pay $1? Would that have a devastating effect on freedom of speech? $1 and a retraction? That's not at all clear.
Well, let's talk for a minute about lying to tell the truth. Oftentimes journalists use deceptive methods such as impersonations, non-identification, and fabrication. And is that problematic in our quote unquote post-truth and whataboutism world?
Okay, so this is a great and big question. I think just as a matter of good practice, journalists need much more soul searching on this front than we've observed. So if journalists are actually misstating something with some justification that seems honorable, we need to think again about that. And if journalists are repeating things that they know to be true as part of here's one side and here's another side, that's not responsible. So a story that says the equivalent of Jones says dropped objects fall, Smith says they actually don't, and that's stated by so-called experts who are interested in controlling us. I've chosen an absurd example, but you can find easily stories that have that form, where one side will be quoted, whom any responsible journalist will either actually know or have reason to know that side is full of nonsense. And there are grounds on which it's okay to do that, to show citizens the nonsense that's out there. That's fair. But if it's a way of giving an account, let's say, of a person, a Republican or a Democrat, or an actor or a musician, where these people say this and those people say that, and one side is the journalist knows full of nonsense. For the journalist to do that is not consistent, let's say, with the highest ideals of the First Amendment to the US Constitution.
So are you familiar with, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on Singapore's Protection of Online Falsehoods Act, as a starting point towards regulating falsehoods on social media?
I'm not familiar with it, but the idea of a law called the Online Falsehoods Act makes me very, very nervous. The idea that the Supreme Court expressed in an opinion I disagree with, I think, in 2012, the idea that we don't have a ministry of truth here is a beautiful idea. So an Online Falsehoods Act seems to be very broad, an act that would be about online libel or about deep fakes or about democracy protection, let's say, or about health and safety. That seems more scalpel than axe. And for online falsehoods, scalpels, no axes.
So I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. We're kind of coming up towards the end of the hour, but both of these are sort of, they're either softballs or real hardballs. I'm not quite sure, but last year we had Michael Rich from the Rand Corp talking about truth decay. And he made a great case for the dismissal of facts being a major threat to the very foundations of our democracy. And one of our audience members asks, if we can't trust government officials to determine truth, how can we trust Facebook or Twitter?
Okay, well, this is something where I think I'm with Blake and not with Sir Joshua Reynolds. So to say, can we trust Facebook or Twitter, or can we trust our government? These are extremely broad and provocative questions. Should the government allow perjury? Should the government allow false commercial advertising? Should the government allow false reports to the Federal Bureau of Investigation? I think the answer to all of those questions is no, the government shouldn't allow those things. And we can distrust the government with respect to truth generally. That's a good thing for freedom-loving people to do, while also agreeing saying something like what President Biden sometimes says, come on, man, to the proposition that distrust of government means that all falsehoods are allowed. If you try to sell cereal to children or to adults saying, do this and you never get cancer, and that's just false, that's fraud. And the government can, thank goodness, do something about fraud. Facebook and Twitter, you can think, I don't really trust them particularly, but if someone says on Facebook or Twitter, the election's been canceled this year, so please don't even try to vote, do we think that because we don't trust Facebook and Twitter, we should forbid Facebook and Twitter from doing anything about that? Or we should weep when Facebook says, let's say, we're not going to allow lies about the timing of elections? I think we shouldn't weep about that. So the distrust operates at such a high level of abstraction that it can't tell us how to deal with the concrete question, what should Facebook do about lies about X or Y or Z? And my little framework, imperfect as it is meant as an effort to discipline the two sides, let's call them, who are saying freedom, freedom, exclamation point, and oh my gosh, our democracy is collapsing, exclamation point. They both have a point, kind of, but what are we going to do about a concrete problem? We need a framework.
So in the last year, in the wake of protests, which, as you know, here in Portland, being, we're no longer an anarchist jurisdiction, but we were for a while. But seeing the amazing amount of looking at race and protest and legacy and history and the downing of monuments, and this phrase that has come up and has been used in both a positive and a negative way, depending on what press somebody has filtered their newsfeed for. How does the topic of cancel culture need to be addressed in the environment around facts and truth.
Okay, so if you have someone who says, you know, I believe in race neutrality, and I think affirmative action programs are a violation of race neutrality. And in my view, no institution in our country should have an affirmative action program. That's a view that I not only disagree with, I very strongly disagree with. Nonetheless, there may be a majority on the Supreme Court that thinks that. It's a view that deserves an airing in our country. It doesn't speak for Martin Luther King, though it sometimes purports to. To treat someone who says something like that as a demon rather than a citizen who has a view is to lose our moorings, I think. So cancel culture, insofar as we are thinking of canceling people who have views that deserve an airing, even if they are, in my view at least, not merely wrong, but very, very wrong, that would not be a good idea. On the other hand, if someone says, you know, something genuinely hateful about an individual or a race that falls unambiguously in that category, to speak out in a way that's pretty strong about that hateful communication is fair. The word cancel, you know, it has a flatness to it. To cancel someone who's right of center merely for having convictions that people left of center don't like is horrible. But to take a strong stand against people who've said genuinely hateful things is fair. So we need to know exactly what we're talking about, I guess. I do think that Jesus had some nice, yes, but also profound things to say that bear on cancel culture. He who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. So to have that as a cautionary note about stone casting is a good thing. But freedom of speech allows us to say, you know, that was extremely hurtful. And in a democracy, I wish people wouldn't say things like what you just said. That's completely fair.
Thanks a lot. Cass, I want to thank you for a really wonderful presentation, great perspective, really, really thoughtful answers to some great questions from the audience. And I'm going to throw it back over to Derek to take us out into the evening. And again, thanks so much for taking the time with us. Your dogs were wonderful. They made a nice cameo. And our best to Samantha and the family. So.
Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure.
I just want to echo Tim and thank you for that really robust and thought-provoking discussion. A huge thanks to the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust for helping to make tonight's talk possible. A reminder that you can buy his book at Broadway Books, our local partner. And I look forward to seeing many of you at our upcoming fundraiser. I'll post the information there in the chat. But again, Professor Sunstein, thank you so much. And we look forward to having you in the future and just greatly appreciate your sharing your expertise with us tonight.
Thank you. And thanks everybody for coming and for the great questions.
Everyone stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you at our next program. Good night.